In your Son's name we pray, and we ask for these things. Amen.
Good evening. I am glad to be back with you to talk about two subjects, the relationship of two subjects that I enjoy studying a lot, Christianity and the Bible. I know with a topic like this, there's a certain number in the audience who are excited about that, and I know there are a certain number in the audience who come with a little sense of dread. Science, it's going to be technical, it's going to be arduous. It's not tonight. We're going to keep a really high-level view. We're not going to get deep in the woods on anything particularly technical. We're going to talk about some things that are thoughtful, but not particularly technical this evening. And two subjects that I really, really enjoy us talking about together. Christianity and science. Can they coincide together? Let's begin with just the foundation. You could talk about science itself a long time, and Christianity a long time. So to talk about both at once, we're going to keep kind of a foundational and broad view. This is my professor. I took a course at the University of Florida called Human History and Evolution. It was taught by an outstanding professor. She was a very good teacher, very well respected in her field. It was an anthropology course. It was all about the alleged pre-humans, Neanderthal man, Lucy, all those, that collection of critters or people, whatever. And day one, I still have my notes from that. Day one, this was in my notes. This is science. Science is empirical testing, continual testing and empirical evidence. Belief is faith and doctrine. And of course, her statement was, this class is science. We're not doing faith and doctrine. That's for something else. This is what we're going to talk about, and that goes somewhere else. And what she was really getting at is trying to establish a foundation that science is reality. What you believe in, whatever that is, it's myth or superstition or it's religion, whatever that is, that's over there and this is here. And that was the foundation of science to her. And she drew a hard line between those two things. And that's a key point. Science is reality. And there's a hard line between science and what you hold as your belief. That was the foundation of the course. And that struck me then, of course, as, well, that's not right. And it's exceedingly not right, but it was stated by a professor who was very accomplished in her field, very polite to me, very courteous and professional to me. We had a couple of discussions in her office. She knew how I felt about things, what I believed about things. She was professional all the way, through and through. And yet she could tell the whole class, this is science and this is your belief. The fact is, whatever you do, you hold on to a worldview somehow. Science has to tether itself to something. There's a famous German physicist, Max Planck. If you study physics, there's something called Planck's constant. It's a part of quantum mechanics. I'm no physicist. That's about all I know. That's all I remember. But he made a comment about what is the foundation of science. And he said this: no phrase has ever engendered more misunderstanding and confusion in the world of scholars than the expression, science without presuppositions. It was coined originally by Theodore Mommsen and was meant to express that scientific analysis and research must steer clear of every preconceived opinion. In other words, you're supposed to go into your experiments unbiased. That's what you're supposed to be doing. But it could not be, nor was it intended to mean that scientific research needs no presuppositions at all. Scientific thought must link itself to something, and the big question is, where? And Planck is right. He was very honest about that science has to be connected to something, and it is. You can go back in history and see what science was connected to. Science has been studied for millennia. Aristotle is often credited with being the first biologist. That's the niche of science where I play around. That's my corner of that sandbox. But you can go back a long ways. Robert Boyle, if you took chemistry, maybe you remember Boyle's law, had to do with how gases behave. He said, we ought, whenever we speak of God and of his attributes, to stand in great awe. He was a significant contributor to the advancement of science, had an open faith in God. Michael Faraday, and there's They're a Faraday's constant in physics as well. The book of nature which we have to read is written by the finger of God. And nature is a book of God. That's how the Bible speaks of it. Or James Joule. There's a unit called the joule, named for James Joule. After the knowledge of and obedience to the will of God, the next aim must be to know something of his attributes of wisdom, power, and goodness as evidenced by his handiwork. You see in these examples, people who contributed powerfully to the advancement of science while holding on to an obvious faith in God. Whatever faith, however, that manifested itself religiously, I don't know. But an obvious faith in God. One more. Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, the one who keeps your milk fresh longer. The more I study nature, the more I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. The history of science is filled with individuals who contributed to scientific knowledge while having a strong belief in God. And historically, science succeeded profoundly well linked to a belief in God. Things have changed dramatically, of course, and nothing makes that more clear, I don't think, than this next quote. It was made by Richard Lewontin. He was an evolutionary biologist, very, very successful biologist, very, very renowned. He was a Harvard, at least at one point, Harvard. I think that's where he ended his career. And in the late 90s, he was doing a review of a book, and he said this quote: "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." Now, materialism is the link to which science tethers itself. And I just tethered myself to your podium. It's interesting. I thought, what was that? And materialism is a belief. You can't test materialism. There's no evidence of materialism. It's a belief that material stuff is all that exists. That's what materialism is. And it's a choice to believe that or not to believe it. And you certainly can't test it. And he's right when he said that is the anchor of natural science. It absolutely is. And we have a commitment to it, a prior commitment before we ever begin testing anything. That is the presupposition. Materialism is true. He mentions just-so stories. Maybe you know that reference. That's a Rudyard Kipling reference. He wrote a set of children's stories called just-so stories. We read them to our kids, maybe read them to yours. They're fun stories with made-up words. And they all end with, well, so. That's how it happened. And it's an interesting story, and maybe it could happen in the mind of a child. A crocodile jumps out, grabs the tug, there's a tug of war, and eventually that's how the elephant got its trunk. And that's just so. Or that's the just so story. That's a story that sounds good. Put enough pictures to it to make a storyboard in a textbook, and it looks convincing. But when you really look at the story, you think, there's not a whole lot there, actually. That's what he's referring to. He continues, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated." What he says is there's no reason we have to do it this way, but we are forced because we have an a priori adherence to materialism. That is, from the beginning, before you get started, we are committed to materialism. And so we have to produce a set of material explanations. That's inevitable because we've already committed to that, the adherence of material causes. Moreover, that materialism, he says, is absolute. That materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. What Lewontin is saying in this quote, and it's really important for us to get this is the foundation of modern science. It is an absolute commitment to philosophical materialism. And it's critical that we understand that. That is not testable. You can't experiment on that. You can't observe that. But it is the bedrock of natural science. And he's right on that. And the reason they're so committed to that is you cannot let a divine foot in the door. And I think there's two reasons for that. First is there's a great fear that if you allow God to be in the conversation at all, science stops. It's an absurd idea. You hear it all the time. It's Bill Nye, the science guy's greatest rebuke against religion, is it's going to make science stop. And that's just demonstrably false, historically and in the present. There's enough scientists in this room right now to demonstrate that's false. The second is, as we get to the very end of this lesson, there are some who really don't want God in the picture for bigger reasons than that. They aren't just concerned about science being stifled or being stopped. No, what Christians are accused of is something called the God of the gaps. And it means when we have a lack in knowledge, we know this piece of knowledge, we know this piece of knowledge, but we're missing something in the middle. We just say, well, God just does that, and then we quit. And God's the answer for anything we don't know. And that's just demonstrably, again, not true. That's not how it works at all. My colleague and friend, Doy Moyer, 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, posted a little diagram on social media about the God of the gaps. So here it is. I got his permission to steal it, but I told him I'd tell you where it came from. This is the God of the gaps. We understand something on the left, we understand something on the right, we're missing the knowledge in the middle, and we just say, well, that's where God comes into play. And there's all kinds of problems with that idea. It reduces God. The more we learn, God gets squeezed out. The biggest problem is it's just unscriptural. That's not what Scripture teaches about God. God doesn't just fill in things we don't know. He undergirds everything we do know and don't know. This is what God is like. He's the God of everything, what we know and what we don't. He upholds all things, whether we understand them or not. We give God credit for the laws of nature that we understand and those we have not yet understood. Processes we see and those we cannot explain. Passages like Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, speaking of Christ, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and, here it is, upholding all things by the word of his power. Right now, things hold together because Jesus holds them together. That's why the universe continues clicking on as it is. That's why Planck's constant is a constant. Jesus allows that to continue. Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. And he, Jesus, is before all things, and in him all things consist. God undergirds and binds all things together in the natural world. What do Christians do when they see images like this? You all saw this image a couple weeks ago, last month? One of the first images released from the James Webb Telescope. That image comes from an area of the sky the size of a grain of sand from our perspective. You see all those images in there? You all know what those are if you read the news articles, right? Those aren't stars. Those are galaxies. Every galaxy, those are thousands of galaxies. Within every galaxy are millions or billions of stars. It's incredible. It's beyond understanding. And from a fraction of the sky, from our perspective, the size of a grain of sand. Incredible. What do we do as Christians when we see that image? Just throw up our hands? Or do we say, I want to know more about that? That is an incredible God. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars which you have ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you visit him? You have crowned him with glory and honor and made him a little lower than the angels. Christians don't look at nature and quit thinking. They look at nature and think, God did that, and what does that mean about me? It helps us understand who we are as humans, created in his image. That's what we do with that. The fact is, the Bible calls for reason and evidence and testing. We won't read all of these, but passages like 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Peter charges you and me, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Give a reason for it. I just believe because somebody told me to, and it's just the doctrine, and if I don't, I get in trouble. That's why I believe. That's not the faith of a Christian. There's a reason for that. We see Acts, in the book of Acts, Paul, everywhere he went, reasoned and reasoned. That word is used over and over again, convincing people why it's reasonable to believe Jesus was the Son of God who was crucified and rose from the dead, and they need to believe in him. That's why we're Christians after all. We believe in an empty grave. That's the faith we hold on to. It's not astronomy. It's not biology. It is a risen Savior. That's the anchor of our faith. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. That was Acts 17, or again in Acts 18. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks, and on that goes throughout that book. And then we see a similar kind of theme at the end of the book of John when John tells us, this is why I wrote this gospel, chapter 20 and verse 30. And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John only recorded a handful of miracles, maybe 7 or so, in his gospel. But he chose them and he arranged them with a purpose so that we could understand why we ought to believe Jesus is the Son of God. Because that's everything. The faith of a Christian is not because someone told me to. It's because it's reasonable and it makes sense. And I can tell you, there's a reason for the hope that is in me. So not only is reason in our belief, it ought to be, and evidence ought to be in our belief, but to a great surprise of many, there is a lot of theology in science, particularly in biology. At least I know biology, because that's, again, my little corner of the sandbox where I play, is in biology. There's a lot of theology in science. In the 17th and 18th centuries, in fact, there was a movement in biology known as natural theology. And it was people who did what that word sounds like. They used nature to study about God, a natural theology, study of God. And it was very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they looked for the power and wisdom of a creator in creation. And in particular, they looked for God's benevolence, his desire to make us happy. That was a big word back then. It's not a surprise that word is in our Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. And people search that same word in nature. God wants us to be happy. But they often focused on the beautiful, the appealing side of nature. And they struggled to deal with, often, the pain and the suffering and sometimes just the awkward, which is, frankly, everywhere in nature, is it not? It's everywhere. Natural theologians also taught something called special creation, which was the idea that all organisms were created by God exactly as they are right now, perfectly suited for their little spot in nature. And that was really common. Importantly, that's not what the Bible teaches. As they were teaching ideas about God that were unscriptural. When you teach something untrue, consequences follow. And consequences followed from this. Darwin grew up with this view. He was taught this view. It was required reading when Darwin was going through his education to read a book called Natural Theology, written by a man named William Paley. You may know that name. He was most famous for his watchmaker argument. You've heard the watchmaker argument. If you see a watch, you presume there's an engineer, and he then took that analogy and applied it to life. And Paley was really famous for that. Darwin read that, and he was impressed by it, but he also knew the reality of life. He went to med school for a little while. But folks, medicine in the early 1800s was brutal stuff. I mean, it was nasty stuff. And Darwin just didn't have the stomach for it. He lost a sister in life. It affected him very powerfully to lose her. And he was a biologist. And he saw that most things in biology die a pretty gruesome, nasty death. That's just how biology works. And so this idea that the world reflects the beauty and the generosity and the kindness of God, he said, well, how do you see that in this and this and this and this? That's not what I see. And it affected him. He was also affected by the writings of a man named Richard Owen. Richard Owen was an anatomist, and he wrote a book in the mid-1850s called On Limbs. There's a summer reading assignment for you, students. On Limbs. Got to read that one. It's all about appendages of things. And what Owen wrote about in that book is something we know very well. That you take the bones in the arm of a human and compare them to the bones and the appendages of birds, whales, bats, dogs, cats. They're very similar. Same numbers of bones, same arrangements of bones. And Owen looked at that and he decided God wouldn't do that. A creator would have more creativity than that. And you can see how the bones sort of match up by colors here on this screen. philosopher of science commented on Owen, and this is what he said. This is, Stephen Dilly, not a creationist, by the way. What matters is that Owen utilized the claims above as part of his case against special creation. The claims above is God wouldn't organize something like that. He would make limbs unique. These claims included, first, that a God who is free to create as he wishes would create new biological limbs de novo rather than from a pre-existing pattern. That means he'd create each limb fresh. He wouldn't get stuck on a pattern and be boring. A whale limb wouldn't have the same basic bone pattern as a human limb. Second, that God must create biological structures, like limbs, in accord with a human conception of the simplest mode to accomplish the respective functions. You wouldn't see in limbs and other bone structures things that appear to be unnecessarily complicated. And Owens thought he saw things unnecessarily complicated. And third, that God would only create the minimum structure required for a given part's purpose. God should be a minimalist, basically. One might wonder whether Owen had subconsciously gilded God to resemble the archetypal Victorian gentleman, who was at once ingenious and industrious, yet sensibly temperate. I like that description. Here's the point. Owen imposed upon biology his view of what God ought to do. And it's what philosophers now call theology of science. This is what God would or should have done. I don't see that, therefore God didn't do it. That's the argument. And folks, it is everywhere. That argument is everywhere. And it's been there for a long time. Darwin read Owen, and he was impressed by Owen as well. And so Stephen Dilly continues as he talks about Darwin, particularly Darwin's book, Origin of Species. When Darwin invoked Owen to attack special creation, he implicitly replied upon this same line of reasoning. Epistemologically, Darwin needed these theological claims in order to use Owen's argument effectively in crippling special creation. Importantly, remove the theology and a little substance remains. This is what Darwin did in Origin of Species, and it's all over the book. He said, look, I look at nature, and if God designed it, it should look this way. It doesn't look this way. Natural selection would produce what I see. Therefore, God couldn't have done it. It has to be natural selection. The point Stephen Dilly is making is natural selection looks better because Owen and Darwin infused theology into their science. And they took their idea of what God ought to do or what God should have done. And when nature looks different than that, well, obviously God didn't do it, and that makes their argument a lot stronger. Take the theology out of it, and natural selection is a much weaker argument. It's why there were several of Darwin's contemporaries who were friends of Darwin who never bought into natural selection. Because they said, yeah, okay, this explains maybe some things, but there's a lot of things this just doesn't explain very well. And they never bought into it. And this whole fusion of theology into science is rampant. It's all over the place. And it had its roots, importantly, in believers who were trying to see God in nature. And they imposed their own ideas of what they thought God ought to do in nature. Blessing and things that are pleasant and things that are appealing. And when they imposed that idea of God and other people started looking at it and say, well, that's not pleasant and that's not appealing, that doesn't look ordered, and that doesn't make sense, they set Darwin up. They set Darwin up in his day to make a really powerful argument for a materialistic explanation for the origin of species in the world. And Darwin's book sold out like that. One of the most influential books, maybe the most influential book in the last 150 years on our culture. Profoundly influential. And that theology has continued. Dobzhansky was a geneticist. A Russian-American geneticist. He was the great-grandson of Dostoevsky, if you're into Russian novelists. It's a really smart family. Dobzhansky was a geneticist. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He wrote an article with that title in the early 70s, shortly before he died. He died in 73 or 75. He wrote this in the early 70s. That article explains why biology only can be explained by evolution. That title has had such an impact, it is in every textbook I've ever used. When I've ever read, when they start talking about evolution, Dobzhansky's the lead line, always, because it just states it. This has to be true. This is what Dilley commented about this article when he reviewed it. Strikingly, all 7 of Dobzhansky's arguments hinge upon claims about God's nature, actions, purposes, or duties. In fact, without God talk, the geneticist's arguments for evolution are logically invalid. In short, theology is essential to Dobzhansky's arguments. For the same reason, those theology is essential to Darwin's arguments. They hold natural selection up if you present God in a certain way. Stephen Jay Gould in the 80s wrote a whole book about poor design in nature. It's called The Panda's Thumb. And the whole book is case after case of what Gould sees as bad design and why God wouldn't do that. And Gould was a Harvard paleontologist. Richard Dawkins, the British biologist, speaking of the human eye, which seems to be perhaps badly engineered because the end of the cells of our eye that are sensitive to light point backwards. They point to the back of our head. They don't point to where the light's coming in. Whether or not that's bad design is another discussion altogether. The point is, who says so, and how can you say so? This is what Dawkins says about it. Any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells would point towards the light, with their wires leading backwards towards the brain. He would laugh at any suggestion that the photocells might point away from the light. And he continues, what he's doing is the same way. If God designed the eye, it wouldn't look like that. He's imposing a theology on top of the biology. And last, Jerry Coyne, a biologist at the University of Chicago, gets down to genetics, what we see in genetics. Our focus instead is on genomic features that defy notions of a supreme intelligence underlying biological design. Genomic flaws should, in principle, provide a more decisive test of whether unconscious evolutionary processes or cognitive agents have shaped our genes. His point is, we look at how genes work, and it looks to be messy in there too. No designer would do that. Now, it's a fair question to say, who says that's messy or not? Do you really know that, or are we just ignorant about things? But the point is, he imposes his theology. And then one more from my textbook, which I will start using in a couple of weeks. It says this. It gives examples of poor design as evidence for evolution. And it concludes with this. Such examples of poor design illustrate that natural selection is like a tinkerer, working with whatever material is available to craft a workable solution, rather than like an engineer who can design and build the best possible structure for a given task. Workable but imperfect structures, such as the vertebrate eye, there it is again, are an expected outcome of evolution by natural selection. So ever since pre-Darwin, for 200 years, we've had the same argument. God would do it this way, we don't see it that way, therefore God didn't do it. A belief about God, folks, is fundamental to the theory of evolution and the arguments that support it, the most common arguments that support it. It's a powerful argument because it clears the field of any competing ideas. All we're left with is materialism. So a couple key points for us after all those quotes, and that's a lot. I know there's a lot of verbiage up there. First, if I impose characteristics on God which he has not revealed, I impose something untrue. And that's going to have consequences to it. If it's not clearly revealed in Scripture, I don't need to say it's an absolute truth, because I'm imposing something that's not true, and that's going to set somebody up for something wrong. It's what Paley did with natural theology. Second, I am simply not to analyze God to justify or explain him. He is beyond that. And we see that in the book of Job. You're familiar with these passages. If you turn to Job chapter 38, and the way that chapter begins, after Job makes his arguments and he makes his case and he speaks his mind, you know how the message Job receives from God in verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Who do you think you are to try to justify me? That's not my place." Chapter 40 and verse 2, God asks, "Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him?" Or verse 8, "Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his?" Over and over, God says, "It is not my place to try to justify God. He doesn't need that. And if I'm not really careful, my attempts to justify God, I overstate him and I create him in my image, I gild him as I want him to be, and I set people up to lose faith in him because I'm not presenting him. I'm presenting my idea of him. God himself, in fact, states his creation does not show perfect wisdom. To go to Job chapter 38, and as God is describing all the things he's done in nature, he describes this about an ostrich. In Job chapter 38, verse 13, "The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork's? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain, without concern, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider." Here's the point in the book of Job. It expressly says there are elements of nature that clearly do not display wisdom. For whatever reason, God did that to an ostrich. Leaves its eggs laying around, anything can come around, step on and crush it. That's the very kind of evidence that people like Darwin, Dobzhansky, and others look at and say, God wouldn't do that. A designer wouldn't do that. And God says, who do you think you are to contend with me? I did that. For whatever reason, God did it. He did it. And the presence of theology in science is expansive. There's another characteristic of science I want to identify here in the next few minutes before we close. In the world of academics, the common worldview is postmodernism. We used that word last week. There's a lot of elements to postmodernism. The key to postmodernism is that it's relativistic. You make your truth based on your experiences, and everyone's unique. And I have mine, and you have yours, and we all piece together, we construct our own reality. And that's where truth comes from. It's where gender comes from to a postmodernist, right? You construct your own gender. You construct your own truth. And that's the underlying worldview of academics. Except in at least one building, and that's the natural science building. The natural science building, there is an answer. You don't get telescopes in space unless you know how to get that telescope in space. And there is a way to do it, and if you don't do it that way, it's never going to get there. If you don't build the bridge right, people die. If you don't mix the chemicals right, people die. There is a right and there is a wrong in the natural sciences because it depends upon that. And that is a materialistic worldview that underlies natural science. It is materialism. It is not postmodern. Now, postmodernism is creeping in there, and in elements of natural science, it's making its way. But fundamentally, it's materialism, which is absolutism. In fact, that's the word Lewontin used, right? Our commitment to materialism is absolute. And science looks for an answer, because there is an answer in how you build buildings, and how you mix chemicals, and how you keep an airplane up in the air. So it leads to this question. Why do academics allow science to be absolute? Why can science get away with that? But you never get away with that with Shakespeare. What is Shakespeare communicating? Well, there's this and this and this and whatever. What's the best economic theory? This. Political science, who knows where that's going? Here, here, and here, and here. What's motivated this historical figure? Well, there's this. Create your own idea. It's not that way in science. Why not? One reason is that people die if you don't get it right. That's one reason. But it's more than that. Philip Johnson wrote about this. It's been now probably 20 years ago in a book called Reason in the Balance. He wrote about this. And I think he's right. His conclusion is the absolutism of science is the foundation for the relativism in every other discipline. And thus relativism in morality and ethics and anything else you want. He put it this way. Naturalism in science, it should be in science, provides the foundation for liberal rationalism in morals by keeping the possibility of divine authority effectively out of the picture. Remember, that was one of Lewontin's aims, right? You got to be a materialist because you can't let a divine foot in the door. Belief in naturalistic evolution is foundational to a great deal else. And so it can hardly be presented as open to doubt. The schools accordingly teach that humans discover the profound truth of evolution, but they invent moral standards, gender, and they can change them as human needs change. I think Johnson's right. The reason natural science is allowed to get away with it is because it allows everything else to be relativistic, because nature is all there is, and there's no place for God in our discussions. Materialism answers everything of why we're here and what it means to be human and where we're going. And everything else can run where it wants to run. So what about Christianity and science? What about it? Is this correct? It takes about 5 seconds to think that's not correct. Of course there is faith and doctrine in science. And of course there is empirical evidence and continual testing in belief. Of course there is. And in the big questions that we're talking about, everything boils down to belief. What does it mean to be human? Where are we going? Does God exist? Where did species come from? That's all boils down to faith. Science and Christians both need humility. Nature is the subject of science, and it too is God's revelation. Psalm 19 and verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. You know that passage. Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Can Christianity and science coincide? They have for hundreds and hundreds of years. Don't be afraid of science. Don't be afraid of it. We need people going into it. Students, we need people going into it to study it. Go into it knowing its foundation, knowing the worldview behind it. And if you know that worldview, you're going to be okay. If you know what it's based upon. Be open with your questions and doubts. I've had plenty of mine. I'm a biologist. Studied evolution under the feet of Dr. Lincoln Brower. It means nothing to you. In biology world, he's a big dude, big name. He was a member of the Linnean Society, the International Honor Society for Biologists. But you know he made it really big because he was on Reading Rainbow. He died 3 or 4 years ago, and the New York Times had an obituary on him. When biologists die, no one notices. They're just biologists running around forests and stuff. Brower was a big-name guy. And when I was sitting in his class, little peon undergrad, at the feet of Lincoln Brower, and he said, 5% of our DNA does what DNA does. The other 95% doesn't do anything. It's all junk, evidence of our evolutionary past. What do you say to that? What you need to say is, you're probably 95% ignorant of what DNA does. And that's what we've learned. That's the evidence of theology. No designer would build DNA with 95% that doesn't do anything. Obviously, it evolved. It's the same argument. Be open with your questions. I've had many. And Christians, when people come to us, questions about the existence of God and how God does things and why he does things, we need to react in a way that is not shocked or threatened. But listen to them. We've got to be open to questions and help them find their answers to faith, because the answers are there. Christianity and science should work seamlessly together, ultimately sharing the same foundation, looking to answer the big questions of truth. And the big questions come down to faith. It is by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Thank you very much for listening.